Friends, fellow Americans, something just happened in Washington that almost no one's talking about. While the cameras were focused on overseas summits and campaign headlines, a pen stroke took place behind closed doors, quiet, deliberate, and loaded with consequences. President Biden just signed a new law, one that barely made the evening news, but whose impact will ripple through every corner of this country. It was done without ceremony, without questions, without the kind of public debate a democracy deserves. And that's exactly why it matters. Because when laws are passed in silence, it's not by accident, it's by design. This isn't about a small technical bill or some harmless amendment. This is about the quiet rewriting of rules that decide how power moves between government, corporations, and you. The White House described it as a measure to strengthen national security and digital resilience. But buried deep in the text, hidden in the fine print that few have actually read, are provisions that grant the executive branch unprecedented new authority over data, infrastructure, and, yes, even speech. Now, I've seen moments like this before. Every administration has its secret law, the one sold as safety, as modernization, as reform. But history tells us that whenever power expands behind closed doors, it rarely stops expanding. This law was written in the language of protection, yet it may end up protecting the government from its own people more than protecting the people from any threat. And that's what makes it so dangerous, not because it's loud, but because it's quiet. If you're wondering why no one's talking about it, that's part of the story too. When major outlets go silent, when Congress barely debates a measure that affects the digital and personal lives of millions, you have to ask yourself, who benefits from the quiet? Who gains when the public looks away? Because while most Americans were going about their week, this administration quietly gave itself new tools that could reshape how privacy, information, and even dissent function in this country. Tonight, we're going to unpack exactly what's in that law, what it says, what it hides, and why it was signed without the transparency we were promised. We'll trace how this bill was written, who backed it, and what it reveals about the future of power in America. Because this isn't just about one signature. It's about a pattern, one that's been building for years, where the most important changes to our freedom don't happen in public debate, but in the silence of locked rooms. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see that simple image, a president at his desk, a pen in hand, and a smile for the cameras. Behind that smile, something far more serious just became law. When the cameras shut off and the lights in the briefing room dimmed, a single document slid across a polished desk in the Oval Office. Few outside the inner circle even knew it existed, and fewer still understood what it meant. Officially, it's called the National Digital Security and Integrity Act, a name so sterile and bureaucratic that it could lull anyone into indifference. But beneath that bland title lies one of the most sweeping expansions of federal authority over information, communication, and infrastructure in modern history. It's a law that redefines what security means and what it costs. The public was told this bill was about protecting critical systems from cyber threats. The language sounds reasonable, even noble. Who wouldn't want stronger protection against foreign interference, hackers, and misinformation? But buried inside the hundreds of pages, lines written in dense, evasive legalese, are clauses that give the executive branch unprecedented discretion over what qualifies as a digital threat. And that definition is the key. Because once you control the definition, you control the power. Section 203(b), for example, allows the Department of Homeland Security, under direct authorization from the President, to restrict, delay, or suspend access to any platform, service, or network deemed to be under foreign influence or posing a risk to national unity. It doesn't specify what risk means. It doesn't require a court order. It doesn't even demand that evidence be presented publicly. It simply says that the executive, in coordination with designated agencies, can act. In plain English, if the administration believes something online could destabilize the country, they can pull the plug instantly. For years, government insiders and civil liberties advocates have warned that vague legal terms are the birthplace of overreach. Words like foreign influence, national security, and stability sound objective, but they are elastic. They can stretch to mean whatever those in power want them to mean. During the Cold War, national security justified surveillance of journalists and activists. After September 11th, it justified mass data collection without warrants. And now, in the digital age, it may justify something far larger: direct executive control over the infrastructure of communication itself. When I first read this law, what struck me wasn't just the content, it was the process. There was no primetime announcement, no bipartisan signing ceremony, no televised Oval Office address. It was signed in silence. A few aides, a few cameras, a brief press release. The law took effect immediately. And the timing wasn't random. It was signed on a Friday afternoon, buried under the news cycle of international conflict and economic reports. The old Washington trick: drop the big stories when the public is distracted. Because silence, in politics, isn't the absence of noise. It's the presence of control. Let's be clear, this isn't about whether you trust Biden or not. It's about whether you trust any future president with this kind of unchecked power. Because history doesn't remember the intention of laws, it remembers their use. A law written to fight cybercrime today can be used tomorrow to silence dissent, restrict journalism, or shut down movements. All it takes is a redefinition of threat. The ink may be Biden's, but the power it grants belongs to the office, not the man. And once that power exists, it never disappears. It waits. Imagine a future administration, one less restrained, more partisan, more ruthless, using this same law to protect national stability by monitoring political speech, restricting platforms, or labeling independent media as foreign influence. That's not speculation, that's precedent. And precedents, once set, don't fade, they metastasize. Every new White House inherits them. Every president pushes them a little further. Every time, the justification sounds the same: we're just keeping America safe. You might think, well, Congress must have debated this, right? They didn't. The bill passed under a special provision bundled with a defense spending package. There were no public hearings, no televised testimonies, no major votes broadcast to the nation. Lawmakers who opposed it were accused of standing in the way of security. The bill's title itself was a political shield, because who wants to vote against integrity and security? That's how modern legislation works: dress control in the language of safety, and the public will thank you for it. Even more troubling is how corporations played a role. Major tech firms quietly supported the bill, submitting language through private advisory panels. Why? Because it gives them something to legal cover. Under Section 305, companies that cooperate in good faith with federal directives receive full immunity from civil liability. That means if your data is seized, your account is frozen, or your communication is restricted as part of a national directive, you can't sue the platform or the government. Your recourse, your right to challenge, gone. This isn't conspiracy, it's coordination. A seamless merging of government oversight and corporate compliance, both protected by legal immunity. And if that sounds familiar, it's because we've seen it before. In 2008, telecommunications giants were given similar immunity for their role in warrantless surveillance under the Bush administration. At the time, the argument was temporary necessity. But 16 years later, that surveillance infrastructure is permanent. The same pattern is unfolding again, only this time, it's not your phone calls being monitored. It's your entire digital existence. And the genius, or horror, of this law lies in how it was built to look harmless. It doesn't say the government can censor speech. It says the government can ensure the integrity of digital ecosystems. It doesn't say your data can be accessed. It says information may be reviewed in pursuit of national defense. Every line is written in a calm, professional tone of bureaucratic neutrality, the kind of language designed to make your eyes glaze over. Because they know most people won't read it. Now, let's talk about the silence that followed. A handful of reporters tried to raise questions during a briefing. The White House press secretary responded with the same script repeated since the Patriot Act era. This administration is committed to both security and privacy. Then she moved on. Not a single mainstream network ran a deep dive that night. A few independent outlets did, but their stories were quickly buried under the algorithmic noise of entertainment and scandal. The machinery of distraction did its job perfectly. Meanwhile, the people whose lives will be shaped by this law, you, me, every citizen connected to the digital world, remain largely unaware. We scroll, we post, we watch, and all the while, a new rulebook is being written about what we're allowed to see, say, and share. The infrastructure of the internet, once the wild frontier of free expression, is quietly being turned into a monitored corridor. Every click, every post, every opinion travels through new layers of invisible control. I'm not saying this law will erase free speech overnight. But it doesn't have to. All it needs to do is make people think twice before they speak. It only has to introduce hesitation. Because once citizens begin to censor themselves, the government no longer has to. Fear becomes efficiency. And in that hesitation, that small, invisible pause before someone says what they think, democracy begins to erode. Not through violence. Through silence. That's what this law represents, a quiet recalibration of power. It's not tyranny in boots, it's tyranny in a suit. It's polite. Procedural. Paper-bound. It tells you it's keeping you safe while slowly teaching you that safety requires obedience. And the most terrifying part? It works, because most people will never realize what they just lost. This is how freedom fades in the modern age. Not with the roar of a dictator, but with the quiet confidence of a pen signing something for your protection. And as the ink dries, another inch of independence disappears, not in public debate, but in the fine print no one reads. Every generation faces its own test of freedom, and this one comes disguised as protection. What Biden just signed into law isn't a weapon built of force or fear, it's built of structure, an architecture of quiet oversight designed to reshape how the state interacts with its citizens. The National Digital Security and Integrity Act may sound like a technical fix for cybersecurity, but the deeper you read, the clearer it becomes. This is not about security. It's about control through compliance. To understand its design, you have to see it for what it really is, not a single law, but a framework. On paper, it gives the government new tools to protect critical infrastructure, but its reach extends far beyond servers and data centers. It touches everything that connects us, from your smartphone to your social media feed, from banking networks to independent journalism. The law uses the word integrity over 100 times, but nowhere does it define what that means. Who decides what digital integrity looks like? Who determines which narratives undermine public confidence? Once again, the answer is the same, the executive branch. In Section 104, the President is granted authority to establish and oversee a National Digital Council, a panel composed of representatives from public, private, and civic sectors. It sounds inclusive until you realize those representatives are appointed, not elected. Their meetings aren't public, their records aren't open, and their decisions are classified under national security exemptions. The Council's purpose? To coordinate information integrity policies across federal agencies and digital platforms. In other words, it's a bridge between government and big tech, and it doesn't answer to you. This is the kind of quiet architecture that changes a democracy without appearing to. It doesn't break the Constitution, it sidesteps it. It doesn't remove free speech, it regulates the systems through which speech flows. And that distinction is everything. Because if you can't find censorship in the text of a law, people will assume it doesn't exist, even while it's happening in practice. Look closely at how this law was drafted and you'll see the fingerprints of strategy. The preamble calls the digital space a new domain of conflict. That one phrase reframes the internet, not as a marketplace of ideas, but as a battlefield. And on a battlefield, oversight becomes defense, and defense becomes justification. Once information is defined as a weapon, controlling it becomes an act of patriotism. Suddenly, speech isn't a right, it's a variable in national security. And under that logic, dissent becomes destabilization. If this sounds abstract, think about how it plays out day to day. The law allows for data harmonization protocols, a bland term that effectively forces major platforms to share information with federal databases under the guise of threat analysis. What kind of information? The metadata of highly active or influential accounts. Translation: the voices that reach. Independent journalists, influencers, podcasters, citizen reporters, anyone who shapes public opinion can be quietly flagged for review. There's no warrant process. There's no transparency report. It all happens under the shadow of integrity enforcement. Even more concerning is Section 309, which authorizes temporary digital stabilization measures. That phrase sounds like something from a cybersecurity manual, but in practice, it allows the government to limit or restrict network activity during periods of elevated threat or civic instability. What qualifies as instability? A mass protest, a viral leak, a whistleblower's story. Under this law, any of those could be cited as justification for limiting access to digital networks in the name of stability. And here's where it gets darker. The law doesn't just expand executive power, it privatizes it. By deputizing corporations to enforce federal guidelines, it merges government oversight with private compliance. Big tech platforms, desperate to avoid liability, will likely overcorrect, flagging, filtering, and deplatforming anything that even smells controversial. And when you ask them why, they'll point to federal compliance standards. In that way, the state never needs to censor anyone directly. It simply builds a system that makes censorship the path of least resistance. If this sounds familiar, it's because we've seen it before, in smaller, subtler forms. During the pandemic, content moderation partnerships between government agencies and social platforms were used to curb misinformation. Many of those partnerships operated in good faith, but they set a precedent: coordination between state and platform. What was once a temporary emergency measure has now become permanent law. And it's no longer limited to health information, it applies to everything. What makes this blueprint so effective is its invisibility. Unlike the overt surveillance programs of the past, this one doesn't require monitoring everyone, it only needs to manage the flow of information. Algorithms do the work, filtering what you see, nudging what trends, and suppressing what doesn't. The result is a democracy that still looks free, but whose boundaries are algorithmically enforced. And that's the kind of control no authoritarian regime in history could have dreamed of: control without coercion, obedience without oppression. Even within the government, a quiet unease is spreading. Several lawmakers have admitted, off record, that they hadn't read the full bill before it passed. It came as part of a security package, one aide said, and no one wanted to be the person voting against cyber safety. That's the brilliance of modern legislation: name it well, hide it deep, rush it fast. Democracy by branding. A single word like security or integrity can paralyze scrutiny. Because if you question it, you risk being labeled as the opposite, as insecure, unpatriotic, dangerous. But beyond the language, beyond the bureaucracy, there's a psychological strategy at work here. The architects of this law understand that people fear chaos more than they value liberty. They know that after years of division, economic strain, and disinformation, Americans crave order. So they give them order, a managed, filtered, sanitized order. A digital calm. But underneath that calm, the system learns, tracks, adjusts. It grows smarter, quieter, more efficient. And when a future administration inherits it, they won't need to change the law, they'll just change the definitions. That's the real genius, and the real danger, of this blueprint. It doesn't depend on ideology. It survives every election because it's built into the machinery itself. Whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in office doesn't matter, the system of control stays the same. The faces change, the slogans change, but the structure remains. Because once a power is normalized in law, it stops being political, it becomes procedural. Some might argue that this is necessary, that we live in an age too volatile to leave digital spaces unguarded. And there's truth to that. Cyber threats are real. Misinformation spreads faster than facts. But the question isn't whether protection is needed, it's who controls the definition of protection. Because the moment security becomes a blanket justification, it stops protecting and starts governing. So when you hear officials say this law protects our democracy, remember, democracy doesn't need protection from its people, it needs protection from its protectors. The minute power decides it knows what's best for the public and builds a system to enforce that belief, the social contract flips. We're no longer citizens participating in governance, we're subjects managed by it. That's the future this law quietly builds, a future where compliance feels like safety and dissent feels like danger. A future where freedom still exists on paper but is algorithmically throttled in practice. It's not dystopia, it's design. And if we don't start questioning it now, by the time we realize what's happened, the walls will already be digital, the locks already coded, and the key already out of reach. There's something eerily familiar about how this story is unfolding. Every time a government reaches too far, it begins with words that sound harmless. Integrity. Stability. Protection. The script never changes, only the technology does. The National Digital Security and Integrity Act is not the first time the American government has traded privacy for safety. But it may be the first time that trade has been invisible, automatic, and permanent. It's not a cage you can see. It's a system that learns what you fear, what you believe, what you say, and then quietly decides what you're allowed to know. In a way, that's what makes this law so different from the blunt instruments of the past. It doesn't need secret police or midnight raids. It doesn't need a press blackout or an official censor's stamp. It operates through something far more effective: digital silence. A silence made of algorithms, compliance agreements, and subtle changes to visibility. You'll still be free to speak, but fewer people will hear you. You'll still be able to protest, but your event will fail to trend. You'll still be allowed to question authority, but your audience will shrink until it feels like shouting into a void. That's not oppression in the traditional sense, it's engineered irrelevance. This is how modern control works, through bandwidth, not brutality. When information is filtered by systems no one fully understands, freedom becomes statistical. It still exists, but only within parameters that don't threaten power. And what's terrifying is that this control doesn't feel oppressive, it feels convenient. It feels like safety. Because every mechanism that now watches, analyzes, and regulates was sold to us as protection. Protection from hackers, from disinformation, from chaos. But what happens when the protectors become the ones defining what chaos is? The most dangerous laws are the ones that align with your fears. And the architects of this policy know exactly what those fears are. They've studied the past decade of social division, the misinformation wars, the online extremism, the breakdown of shared truth, and they've learned a lesson from it. People will accept almost any level of control as long as it's framed as defense against the chaos they despise. So instead of restricting power through transparency, the government is expanding it through reassurance. Trust us, they say. We're keeping you safe. But safety without accountability is the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. Let's imagine how this might unfold in the coming years. A viral video circulates, a whistleblower exposing corruption inside a federal agency. Within hours, information integrity monitors flag it as potentially destabilizing. Platforms are contacted. Visibility trots. Comment sections freeze. Soon, the content vanishes altogether, not because it violated any law, but because a national digital directive deemed it harmful to trust in institutions. No one was arrested. No one even noticed the switch being flipped. And that's exactly how power wins, not through confrontation, but through disappearance. Some people will call this paranoia. But every example of overreach in history once sounded paranoid before it became obvious. When the Patriot Act was signed in 2001, citizens were told mass surveillance was temporary, a wartime necessity. 2 decades later, those programs are still here, woven into daily life. When social media platforms began moderating content during elections, it was just to stop disinformation. Now, moderation has evolved into full-scale behavioral prediction. Each step feels small until you realize the destination. And with this new law, that destination just came into view. What's most chilling isn't just what the law allows, it's what it normalizes. The idea that privacy is negotiable. That transparency is a threat. That the public shouldn't worry about what it doesn't see. This mindset is how republics become regimes without ever declaring it. The founders designed a system where power is visible, debated, and restrained. But in the digital age, visibility itself has been captured. The battlefield isn't the public square anymore, it's the algorithmic shadow where truth can be quietly edited before you ever notice. Consider this: right now, as you scroll through your feed, you already live inside a soft filter of personalization. What you see, what you believe, what you even think is relevant, all determined by unseen systems optimizing for engagement. The Digital Integrity Act takes that architecture and federalizes it. It doesn't have to change your opinion, it just has to decide which opinions are allowed to survive. And the worst part? You'll think you chose them. That's the paradox of digital control. It gives you the illusion of freedom while guiding your choices with invisible hands. It's democracy redesigned as a user interface. You still get to click, scroll, vote, and speak, but the options are already curated. And each time the system protects you from something harmful, you become a little more dependent on it, a little more compliant, a little less curious. Until one day, questioning the system feels as strange as questioning gravity. Now, think about how this affects the next generation. Children growing up under this law will never know what the open internet was like. They'll live in a filtered world where the boundaries of thought are preset by code and policy. And because they won't remember what came before, they won't know what they lost. That's the perfect victory for control, not when it silences people, but when it raises new citizens who can't imagine freedom as anything other than a slogan. The architects of this system count on that. They're not planning for next year, they're planning for decades. They understand that real control doesn't come from force, it comes from forgetfulness. You don't have to ban ideas if you can make them disappear from relevance. You don't have to destroy debate if you can drown it in noise. And you don't have to censor the truth if you can make the lie more convenient. The algorithm doesn't care about ideology, it cares about efficiency. And efficiency, in the hands of power, becomes obedience. But here's the part no one talks about: once a government builds a machine like this, it doesn't go away. Even if a new president promises reform, the machinery stays. The databases, the councils, the private partnerships, all remain. And each administration tweaks it, expands it, perfects it. It's not a partisan weapon, it's an institutional one. And because it's invisible, there's no clear moment of rebellion. There's just gradual adjustment, one generation accepting as normal what the last would have called unthinkable. This law, signed quietly, almost casually, is the blueprint for that future. It transforms public safety into permanent supervision. It turns national security into justification for selective silence. And because it was signed behind closed doors, there was no collective consent, no national conversation, no reckoning. The government didn't need to convince the people, it just needed to keep them distracted. And that's where we are now, a country where every major event blurs into the next, where outrage is constant but focus is fleeting. The perfect environment for quiet revolutions. The public is too overwhelmed to see the pattern, and those who do are too fragmented to stop it. This is how control becomes culture, by exhausting resistance before it begins. But make no mistake, silence is never neutral. It's the choice that power wants you to make. Every time a citizen says, "It doesn't matter," a door closes. Every time a journalist hesitates to report, a light dims. Every time a voter gives up on caring, a system grows stronger. That's the math of authoritarianism, one silence at a time. So, when we talk about this law, we're not talking about a single event. We're talking about the moment America's digital democracy was quietly rewritten. The moment freedom became conditional. The moment the line between protection and control blurred for good. And the question now isn't whether this law exists, it's whether we'll notice what it's becoming before it's too late. Because one day, long after the signatures have faded and the cameras have moved on, people will look back and ask, when did it happen? When did freedom become permission? And the answer will be right here, in the silence that followed a law no one read. My friends, this wasn't just another bill signed into law, it was a message. A quiet one, written in the language of security, hidden behind closed doors, and sold as protection. But the truth is simple: every time power expands in silence, freedom contracts in the dark. What President Biden just signed may not change your life tomorrow, but in time, it could change what it means to speak, to question, to know. And that's why you can't stay silent now. The biggest mistake any democracy can make is assuming someone else will defend it. If you believe the people deserve transparency, if you believe freedom should never be managed in secret, then say it. Share it. Make noise. Tell me what you think. Was this law necessary, or was it a step too far? Do you believe it protects us or controls us? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep uncovering what really happens behind those closed doors, the stories they don't want you to hear, then like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Because truth doesn't survive on silence, it survives on awareness. Stay awake. Stay informed. And never forget, the moment we stop watching, power stops asking for permission.